We have watched as God has encountered humanity, and humanity has encountered God here in Genesis. We started with creation, and then Adam and Eve, and Cain and Abel and Noah, which led to a recreation of the world. All of these people created in God's own image. And all of these people who struggled to listen to the voice of God over the voices of the world. And last week, when Abram encountered God, he was invited into a journey to grow into who he was created to be. God promised Abram that he would be blessed, that the entire world would be blessed through him. Abram chooses to listen to the voice of God. Abram and Sarai and Lot pack up all their belongings and take all of their people and begin a long, long journey. They go to the land that God has promised. They leave behind security and power and everything that they have ever known for the promise of God, that God will bless them, that they will become someone new, that God will never leave them. They go for themselves. And also remember that after years of walking, Abram goes back to God and asks God, when will this promise be fulfilled? After all, they're the age of great-grandparents now, and they still have no children. How could this possibly happen? And God tells Abram to count the stars in the sky, because that is how great in number his descendants would be. I am the God of abundance and goodness, Abram. God says, do you trust me? Will you listen to my voice above all these other voices of doubt and fear and shame? And Abram chose to believe God. But the next day, when Abram gets up, not much has changed. They're still on this journey to who they will be, still Abram and Sarai. They still have wealth and divine favor, but they don't have that thing that they are longing for. They still have no children to bear this promise. But Sarai has a plan, and it involves her slave. You see, in the ancient world, if you were a wealthy woman who could not have a baby, you were allowed to give a female that you enslaved to your husband to be an extra wife. And if that slave gave birth to a son, you could claim that son as your own. Problem solved, right? As long as the slave had a son, Abram and Sarai would now have a child in which to receive this blessing of all the generations through. So Sarai goes to Abram and tells him the plan, and he agrees. And I'm going to pause the scene right here before we go on to the next part of the story, because I want to take a moment and be clear. This is a really hard story, and I don't want to pretend that it isn't or pretend that these horrible things are all a part of God's plan. What happens in the story today is wrong. It's never okay to use another person without their consent, and consent can only happen when we agree to something freely without fear of punishment. And this slave woman cannot do that. And it would be really nice if the Bible said that here, but it doesn't, because this story reflects the world that the storytellers lived in. But as we read it today, we read this with the voice of God from other stories. The voice of God in Genesis 1 that says every human is made in the image of God. The voice of God in the prophets who reminds us that God loves justice and hates oppression. The voice of God that says all creation is beloved, both Abram and Sarai and the slave woman. So I invite you to keep this in mind, that perhaps this terrible story is not a part of God's plan. Perhaps it is a reflection of the storyteller's world. So back to the story. No one discussed this plan with the slave woman. No one asked for her consent. No one offered her a choice. This woman had to work for them and do whatever they said, and even if they treated her horribly, she couldn't leave. This woman is not important to Sarai and Abram. In fact, they don't even refer to her by name. Her name is never mentioned by Abram or Sarai in chapter 16. They only refer to her as the slave. Even though God chose Abram and Sarai, and even though God said they would be the father and the mother of uncountable generations to come, even though God called them blessed, they forgot to listen to God's voice. Instead, they listened to the voice of the world, the ones that called Sarai barren, childless, infertile. The voice that said impossible, that Sarai was crazy to believe that this could ever come true. And because they listened to the wrong voice, instead of waiting, they decided that maybe God needed some help with the plan. They tried to grab what God had already given them freely. And so they decided that Abram would marry this slave woman. This woman becomes Abram's wife, and then she becomes pregnant. Her belly got bigger and bigger as this baby grew inside her. And for the first time, maybe she held her head up high. She was important now. But this made Sarai jealous and furious. The bigger the slave woman's belly grew, the worse Sarai treated her. Finally, Sarai persuaded Abram to let her punish the slave woman. "Do what you want," Abram said. Abram held the power, but he did nothing to protect this new wife, this one who was carrying his child. So Sarai severely mistreats her slave. And as a result of this abuse, the slave woman flees Abram and Sarah's household. She runs to the wilderness until she can't run anymore, tears streaming down her face as she goes. She runs bearing the weight of this baby that she loves, but that she didn't ask for, but that she now carries. She runs from the abuse. She runs from the grief. She runs from the loneliness. She runs from being an outsider, missing her home and her mom and the food of her people, missing the ones who know her by name. And when she can't go any further, she collapses in tears. I imagine ugly tears running down her cheeks, snot running out of her nose, out of breath, exhausted. This woman has nothing left. She might die out here, and what story will be told about her when she does? But that is when she hears it. As she weeps near a well, this woman hears a voice, and the voice calls her by name. For the first time in the story, this woman is called by name. Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? It was an angel of the Lord who called out to Hagar. God was searching for Hagar. She may have been a powerless outsider to Abram and Sarai, but Hagar was known by God. "I'm running away from Sarai," Hagar told the angel. But the Lord told Hagar, "Go back to Sarai and submit to her." This is a hard pill to swallow. And again, this is a problematic part of the story, but we'll acknowledge the tension and continue in the story as the writers of Genesis did. Because just as Sarai had a plan to use her slave woman, God had a plan for Hagar too. "Your child will be a boy, and you will call him Ishmael," which means God hears. "He will be a wild man, fierce and independent." And then Hagar does something so brazen and bold that we still remember it today. When Hagar encounters God, the only one who loves her enough to call her by name. Hagar gives God her own name. You are El Roy, Hagar says to God, the God who sees. I have been seen by the one who sees. So Hagar is obedient to God and begins her journey back, but things are different. She has some hope now. She returns to Abram and Sarai just as God told her to do. She bears her son, Ishmael, a son who will not be enslaved like she is, but will be independent and fierce. A son, Ishmael, his very name, a reminder that God has seen her suffering and heard her tears. But Hagar and Ishmael remain outsiders in Abram's and Sarai's family. And during this time, God does finally change Abram's name to Abraham, the father of many, and Sarai's name to Sarah. But Hagar remains Hagar, the mother of Ishmael. When Sarah was 90 years old, she finally gave birth to a son. Abraham and Sarah name him Isaac, which means laughter, for he brought this couple great joy. And we'll talk about that story next week. But the joy of this baby Isaac is not shared with Hagar and Ishmael. Now that Sarah had a baby, she was determined that Isaac would be Abraham's only heir. She insisted that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away, and Abraham did, reluctantly, but away they went. Abraham sent them into the desert of Beersheba with only a small amount of food and water. Hagar and Ishmael walk for days, and their food and water runs out quickly. Without them, Hagar and Ishmael would not survive. Hagar's strength ran out, and her hope wore thin. She could not bear to watch her son die. So she puts him under a bush, weeping at his shallow breaths, at his little voice saying how thirsty he is and how his tummy hurts, and she goes off a little ways. How is this fair? Where was God? How could she lose this son? Why did God not hear her this time? Was she invisible again in her suffering? She fell to the ground in despair and sobbed, helpless as her son cried under the bush. She just wanted to be safe, to be home. But God heard Ishmael crying under the bush. And amid her tears and loneliness, Hagar hears her name for a second time as the angel of the Lord calls to her. Hagar, what is the matter? Do not be afraid. I hear Ishmael crying. I see the injustice and I'm with you. Go to your son. Hold him close. I did not bring you here to die. I have big plans for Ishmael, and I will make him into a great nation. Hagar opened her eyes and wiped away the tears, and she saw a well full of water. Can you imagine her relief as she filled her skins with water and took it to Ishmael to drink? They were saved. They did not return this time to Abraham and Sarah. They settled in the wilderness and started their own family. Hagar. Hagar translates to the stranger. Hagar is a story about an outsider, a foreigner, someone who did not belong, someone who has been used in every way. Her independence, her time, her labor, her body, even her womb. As we already considered, Abram and Sarai never call her by name, and the only name we have is the one that her oppressors named her, the stranger, Hagar. Have you ever felt like that? An outsider, used, someone who doesn't belong, the side character in your own story. But when God sees Hagar, God does not see a stranger, She was never a stranger to El Roi, never a foreigner to the God who sees. When God sees Hagar, God sees the injustice. God hears her cries of suffering. God sees her tears and has not forgotten Hagar. God sees her fear when she's afraid that they're going to die, and God gives her what she needs most: water for her physical body and hope for her spirit. God gives hope to those who feel forgotten. When God encounters Hagar, Hagar trusts that God knows her situation intimately, and she obeys him even when it probably didn't make sense. I cannot imagine the voices that she heard when God told her to go home. Voices that told her she was still a nobody. Voices that told her that she was unlovable, that she wasn't worth being saved, and maybe not worth being safe. Voices that said that she were powerless and unseen. But Hagar didn't listen to those voices. She chose to listen to the voice of God that said, "I see you, Hagar, and I have a plan for you. Do you trust me?" And in a world where God has been the one to change names, to call people into a new way of life and love and being, I love that Hagar gives God a new name here. Not because God has changed or is being called into a new way, but because when Hagar encounters God, this aspect of God is so big that it has to be spoken and named. And I love that the one person in our Bible who dared to name God wasn't a priest or a prophet. It wasn't a king or a war hero. It wasn't a man or anyone who held any kind of power. It was Hagar, a woman, a slave, a foreigner. When God encountered humanity and called them by name, only Hagar had the audacity to name God back. Was it an act of courage? Was she a little out of it from the heat and dehydration? Was it pregnancy brain? I mean, we don't actually know. But I wonder if it was the audacity of hope. Can you imagine the overwhelming sense of belonging when you are seen for the first time in decades? The love that must have wrapped her up when she had been alone for years. Can you imagine the hope that gave her lightness again after facing the worst, that she was not alone in that? Can you hear the voice who told her who she was after years of not hearing it, so long that perhaps she had forgotten it herself? In the overwhelm of that moment, how could you not pour out all you have to the one who sees you? And Hagar has nothing. All she has is the praise and love and hope to return to a God, to the only one who saw her. I have been seen by El Roi, Hagar says. I have been seen by the God who sees me. Our God is a God who sees you. God sees you when you're used and abused. God sees you when you are the one doing the abusing. God sees you when you are without the necessities that you need to live. God sees you when you don't belong, when you feel alone, when you are the outsider. God sees you when you are at the end of your rope. God sees you when you are overlooked and hurting. When you encounter God, God sees you for who you really are, not as the world sees you, other, foreigner, maybe funny accent. God sees God's self, God's image reflected in you, exactly the way you were created to be. When you encounter God, even in moments of fear and loneliness and injustice and despair, you can trust that God knows what you are going through. You are seen by the God who will always see you. As you encounter God, may you have the courage to call God by name. May you trust in God's plan for your good, and may you know that God will always see you. Amen.